Hi, Danny. You'll always be Danny.
Yeah, I can be Danny, that's fine.
Absolutely.
Even though I start manicure next month, I'll be Danny. Thank you for making the video. I know it's hard to do sometimes, but there's so many people that are going to see this and just appreciate it.
Well, I don't know if maybe you should save it for the archives instead of showing it to a lot of people.
Well, first of all, tell us, Joyce, but you're known as Snookie. How did Snookie come about?
You know, I really don't know, and except for the fact that I know that it came about the day that I was born. And
when was that?
That was because Harriet was the one who was another older sister. She was, I think, about 14 when I was born. And when I was born at home, and she said that when she saw me, oh, she looks like a Snookie. And it stuck with me ever since. And that's the only explanation that I have. And I don't know if Snookie was popular or if there was a comic strip at that time. That would have been a good thing. Or what. And it has stuck with me even when I went to college. It was still with me. Joyce, it's something that just doesn't register with me.
But you were happy enough with Snookie, you could have changed
Oh,
it.
absolutely, absolutely.
Well, good.
It's not very distinguished, but I mean, no, I'm not comfortable with Joyce.
Well, I wouldn't know who Joyce and Lester are.
Well, I think most people wouldn't know if they were talking about Joyce Danielson or Joyce Drexel. They wouldn't have a clue as to who Joyce was. But now if you said Snookie, in fact, just recently at church here, they had a list of people and they said Joyce Drexel. And whoever it was had said, well, who is this? I haven't met this person. And is this a new member? Because they were used to hearing Snookie.
Well, tell us now, about your siblings. The oldest was
Okay, Esther was the oldest. And of course, she was gone from home. She had already married and had started her own family. By the time I came into existence, they lived in Yulin. Like the Norwegians would say, Julin. And even John picked that up when he was little. And I couldn't believe it. And he had told someone that this was Julin. And and that went on for I don't know how many years, and finally I corrected it. I said, no, this isn't Julin, this is Yulin. And they lived in, now I almost said it, Julin. But they lived in Yulin until probably beginning of the war, probably about 1942 or so. And at that time they had, I think by that time they had 4 children. And there was one that was about my age that had died. From what I do not know. And the girl is buried in Twin Valley. But they went out west. And Thor, who is Esther's husband, worked for the railroad. And it was really quite an improvement in their living standard. And Esther went out, when she got out there, she worked as in a defense plant. And I can remember her writing letters back, and she was so proud of the fact that she was able to work in this defense plant, and she thought of herself as Rosie the Riveter. And Wes, they had these 3 girls, and then they had Wes, the one boy, and he served in the Vietnam War and really had very difficult times. And Esther died. She had just turned 100, shortly after she turned 100. And I had not seen her since probably in the 70s. So that's why she had been home for all school reunion. And I can remember she felt very much out of place because everyone had, there weren't that many people around, you know, that she knew. And of course, a lot of people had moved away from Twin Valley at that time.
So who came after Esther then?
Okay, Marvel was the next one. And Marvel was the one who remained single. She was engaged at one time, but never married. She was the family banker.
And she lived in St. Paul.
She lived in St. Paul, and Evelyn lived, who was the next one, lived in St. Paul.
And Evelyn married
Maynard Johnson, who was from Ada.
Oh.
And so it wasn't very far away. And really, I don't know that much about them. They would come, the only thing, they would come up one day from St. Paul and go home the next day. And they didn't, I can remember Mom and Dad not appreciate, especially Dad. He would express himself. And he didn't appreciate the fact that they'd come up one day and go back, you know, drive all the way back to St. Paul the next day. Maynard did a variety. He was very handy at a lot of things, but I don't know what they were. But I know he was a barber at one time.
I remember my dad saying he was very impressed with Maynard because he had so many skills.
Yes.
Did some
Yes.
metalworking and carpentry
Yep.
and so
Everything.
Yep. Yep.
Photography
Yes.
was
And
another
a
thing.
good stereo system. I remember from when I was a little kid that caught my attention.
And
And he had a 57 Chevy that was just gorgeous. I remember that when I was a little
okay.
kid. And I remember going to his funeral too. I don't know why, but I do.
I don't remember that. I'm wondering if that was, I must have been in Bemidji. Was I living in Germany at the time?
No. This was, I would have been, I think, maybe 10, so middle 60s. Well, maybe I'm remembering it wrong.
Yeah, well, no,
I thought I
it's
remembered
possible.
that. So after Evelyn then came...
Evelyn came your mother, Hazel.
Hazel, yeah.
Yeah. And she was a cheerleader. To me, everything was positive.
That's where I got that.
Yeah.
And she was so proud of her education, going to Concordia and getting her master's degree at Bemidji State. She was quite the expert in Henry David Thoreau. And
Oh yeah, Thoreau. She would laugh. She'd say, the kids would say Thoreau, throw up.
yeah, we heard about Thoreau for years. And she
Yeah.
seemed like it anyway.
But you know, her major though was Latin.
Yes.
Which was very unusual because of the fact that, you know, Latin, but how helpful it was, you know, for so many people, especially people in the medical field and so on, oh yeah.
I wish she could have lived long enough to know my son because he was is interested in languages and started learning Latin on his own because it was interesting. She would have just loved that.
Oh yeah.
So,
but see, both Larry, but you're good at writing.
I love words, yes.
Yeah, and see, Larry's, I can't wait till his Christmas letters come because they're always fun. And Petra, I was thinking about her this morning again, and she would write these grants for the Indian schools. Mm-hmm. She would never get credit for it, but she was very good at writing grants. And see, that's another thing that's not easy to do.
So talk, after my mom came.
Okay, and then, of course, they lived out in California. Of course, you probably have this on other tapes.
My folks?
Yeah.
Yeah, during the war, they were in California.
And then living in Black Duck. I stayed with them, stayed with your mom. Well, Petra was born, then she was waiting for Larry. And so I stayed, there was no housing that was available right away. So I went up to Black Duck and stayed with her. We lived at a cabin out and meat was at a premium. We ate bear meat for a while. There was a bear that was trapped out on the golf course at Bemidji. And I can remember, actually it wasn't too bad. I think we were so hungry for meat that it was good. But she and I would play cards. Petra was obviously very much in the picture, but I mean, she would, and you know, we'd take her for walks and so on, but when she was sleeping, Hazel and I would play double solitaire. And oh man, I used to see this panorama of cards. This is how much we played solitaire, because I would see these cards at night. I'd close my eyes and I would see this parade of cards. I couldn't believe it. And of course at that time, Hazel, your mom, did not want Petra to be sucking her fingers or her thumb, so she would put these long stockings on a pin them on her so that she wouldn't suck. Well, then Petra was sucking her toes.
And that would have been, well, Petra was born in 43, I think.
Oh, well, anyhow, and then
45, so, yep, okay.
Okay.
And
I did a lot of babysitting for you kids. I mean, I was up in Roseau, I was over on Urban Avenue, I was out in Nymore, I babysat out there, I babysat on Urban Avenue, I babysat, it's Callahan.
Yep, my folks built that in the early 50s. I came along in 55.
Yeah,
so.
And that's when we were, and see, we took you everywhere.
Yeah.
We were married in 55, in May, and you were born in April. And of course, we took Danny everywhere with us, and everyone thought that you were.
Of course, I don't remember it, but I'll.
No, you didn't. But
well, let me back up to your family again. We were at my mom.
Okay.
And coming next is.
Okay. Then after that came Harriet. And she had a lot of health issues, and I was so little that I was aware of the fact that she had health issues, but I didn't know really what they were. I can remember she had to eat a lot of liver. That's the only thing I can remember. And she enlisted though in the Waves, and she served there, and it was shortly after that she met her husband Ernie, and yet they lived only probably about 15 miles apart here in Minnesota, but met out in California, and he was a Marine. And he was in some very, very tough battles during World War II, and had some recovery issues, which today, I mean, back then they didn't really know how to handle them and so on. And the kids talk about it now of what they went through at home, and that they would lock themselves or barricade themselves in some rooms if he had one of these. See, I don't know if you'd call them seizures or what, but you know, to protect themselves, and that really surprised me because I had no idea. I remember when he came to visit us at our house to ask, introduce himself before he married Harriet, and they got married out in Pennsylvania, and after they both got out of the service, I don't know, there again, that's inconsequential, I suppose, but they moved to, they were living in Moorhead, I think, first, and then moved to Fargo. They had many different places.
And then he worked for the Cask Clay Creamery.
Creamery, right.
That must have been a long-term career.
Gosh, it was a long time. In fact, I just talked to a lady the other day who had been a dairy farmer. And she said the life. And then she had gone on to something else, and she said that was a piece of cake, in comparison to being a dairy farmer. Okay, then came the boy in the family. Ernest.
Yeah.
And he was, he was spoiled. Well, you can imagine after all these girls and then having a boy. And I don't remember a lot about him. He was 11 years older than I was. I mean, so you got to remember, I was in first grade and he was ready to graduate from high school. He evidently, I have heard from other people, he was a very good football player. He went into the service, found different ways. He kept changing he was in the Air Force. He was engaged to a Vernus from Gary, and I would hear about his friend Dick Simonson, who we met later on when we moved to Ada. They would take the back roads between Twin Valley and Gary. So that they wouldn't be seen. Ernie would get the pickup, I guess. No one else. I guess the older girls had learned to drive. Artists and I never learned how to. I didn't know how to drive a car till I was married. I was 22 before I learned how to drive. Anyhow, when he was in the Air Force, he changed areas of interest. He was a gunner at one time. He had trained to be a pilot at one time and so on, but he was never sent overseas. And they had lived in Nebraska. He was always interested in cars. They lived in Nebraska. He was a regional supervisor for GM. And, you probably have this from Judy, don't you?
I didn't video Judy, but I know a little bit of his story. He was the GM dealer in
well, yeah, but he was a supervisor first for GM, and then he bought a dealership, and then he went to Grand Rapids, and he got the franchise for everything except Chevrolet. He couldn't get that. They weren't going to give him that franchise, and he worked hard. Oh gosh, I lived with them for 2 weeks, and I've never been so miserable in my life, I don't think, because they were trying to build a house. They had just started this franchise, and there were 3 adults, Ernest, Vernus, myself. She was pregnant, and 5 children in a cabin. Oh, and we would leave for work in the morning. We were out about 13 miles. And of course, that was the only transportation. So I'd go in with Ernie in the morning and,
Did you work?
I worked for him for like about 2 weeks because Drugs had left for the military.
I see.
But yeah.
And after Ernie came
Artis.
Artis.
And that was, I think, about 6 years afterwards. And then she was wonderful, except there was, I think about it now, And I think there was quite a conflict at that time. You know, you think that I came then 5 years later, and see, there's that stretch in there between Harriet and Artis, and so Artis became kind of the boss, and she would boss me around all the time. That's how I looked at it at that time, and she really didn't. But I thought of it as that. And see, Ernie was in between. Well, he certainly wasn't going to get involved with anything. And I was just thinking, oh, she said, I suppose you tell everyone this. And I thought, yeah, I do, because I think it's kind of funny. It was the Christmas time, and I'm going to tell everyone now, too. She had gone to church for something. It was a Saturday morning, and we were to put up the Christmas tree. And she had started, but she had to leave. So she said, Snookie, you put up the tinsel. And of course, at that time, you would put it on one string at a time. Well, who was I to put on one thing at a time? One string. Exactly. That's just exactly what I did. Finally, I lost patience, and I just threw it on the tree. She came home. She was upset, and she made me take everything off the tree, and we had to redo it, and we hung the tinsel again on the tree, one strand by one. And then she would be gone. Ernie had made this beautiful, well, I'm sure you've seen it. You had some of it at your house. The furniture that he made in class, and it had all this wire metal work at the bottom. Okay. Anyhow, your mother, I was very upset with her at one time. He made all this furniture, and it was the metal work that was under was beautifully done, but it was the dickens to dust, and you had to do it, you know, one by one. And anyhow, the folks had given Drex and me the one bench, and I had it at the end of our table, at the end of our bed. And every single night I would fold the bedspread and put it on this bench. Well, your mother decided, and I used it religiously every single night, because our bedspread was too heavy to put over it. Your mother decided that this bench should go to one of Ernie's kids, which I was going to do it, but here your mother said when the kids were there that they should have it. I was not a very happy camper. And I do have to tell you, they got it, which was fine. I mean, it was one less thing to dust, because it was a devil. It really was a dickens to dust. But I can remember growing up, and we had all these pieces of furniture. There was a table, and there was this bench, and it was a footstool. Well, those are only three I can think of, but they were horrible to dust, because you had to go. You couldn't just wipe like this. You had to go piece by piece. And just recently, I gave the footstool to a former student as a wedding present, and the reason I gave it to her was because it would have been her great grandfather who was the instructor of Ernie when he made this. Okay. So I thought this was kind of an interesting connection. But that footstool I even used, because I would sit frequently with but it was a little footstool like this. And Mom, my mother had recovered it, I don't know how many times, but it had the same design as this bench had, but it was beautifully done.
Now, Artis married Bill Bement from
Yes, Black Duck. And they met the summer that Larry was born.
Oh, 45.
Mm-hmm. And they got married not too long. I was a 9th grader.
Okay.
And don't ask me, that's the only measure I can go by.
That's all right. Well, and I knew them, they lived in California.
Well, before that, they lived in Minneapolis because he was a student at the University of oh no, they probably did go to California first.
Well, that's all
Well, I can't remember. But then after he got out of the Navy, he was a student at the University of Minnesota in electrical engineering.
And he worked in aerospace and out there, so.
Very good. In his occupation, there was very little that she knew because what he was doing was classified. And there wasn't much that he could talk about, to her. And as a result, it was very difficult in their marriage, because it was,
I have a watercolor that she did. She got into painting, I know, later in life.
Oh yeah, that's one of hers.
Is it?
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
And that one, well, over there is one of hers.
Okay.
That one wasn't very good. I can't remember if I paid her for that one or not. This is a copy of one that she had. And then I've got one in the bedroom in there that I thought Peggy should have for her cabin.
Oh.
You'll have to take a look at it. She said it's the unfinished geraniums.
Okay. And after Artis?
Comes the baby.
Yeah.
And I was the baby. I remember someone called me a baby when I was 59 years old. Like Chris would say, I've had a warped personality ever since.
Listen, if my mother were here, she'd say the same thing. And I'm going to be 65, so. Well, thank you for that. Talk about your folks a little bit. They were around when I was a kid. Grandma Bertha died when I was 10, but she was so deaf, she just didn't interact with people. And so I know nothing about her. And Oscar was kind of an interesting character, but I don't know him as a person. And he died in, I think, 79 or 80.
Let's see. Mom died the year that John was born.
65, I think.
But I hadn't told them that we were adopting.
Oh.
No, and Dad died in 1980 because that was the year that we had that championship football team, and I was going to funerals. It would be funerals and football games. It was a horrible. I mean, Ernie died, my best friend died, and Dad died. All that. I was running back and forth between Grand Rapids and it was unbelievable.
1980. So tell us about your folks.
You know what? They were so, and I was so, like I was telling Peggy, that I was so independent. And they were 43 and 45 when I was born. Mm-hmm. And by the time you're the 8th one,
Yeah.
I mean, I can even remember the difference between John, the things we did with John and Chris, and yet they were only 2 years apart. And I think by the time, and I was spending all this time over at my neighbor's place. And of course, Mom couldn't hear, and you'd have to shout every time you were talking to her.
So she had hearing issues most of her life, apparently.
Yeah. I don't know of how early it was, but I know at 43 she had difficulty in hearing. Dad was trucking, although he did some mason work. He did beautiful mason work. And I always had all the sidewalks checked out because his sidewalks were the best to roller skate on because they were the smoothest. And I had scrubbed knees, and even to this day, I don't have pigment on my knees because they were constantly scabbed. You know, I'd no sooner we'd race and it would be, you know, gravel. Probably a car had driven over an area and it was gravelled and so on, and we'd race and fall down. And
those roller skates were metal wheels back.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so
you clamped them on, and oh yeah. Even the shoes that you bought during the war, you'd buy, whether or not the kind you bought was determined by clamp roller skates.
Really? I just remembered a story that Marvel knew how to save like a champion. I remember in the 1980s, she was happy that they came out with colored duct tape because it then matched her shoes. And these were shoes she bought during the war. And she was still taping them together all those years later.
Oh, yeah.
And she was happy to have colored duct tape that matched her shoes. So that was...
She would save anything.
Yes, she would.
Of course, Evelyn would too. Certain things like plastic containers. You know, she'd think if we came down to the cities, come over, because she had these plastic Cool Whip things to take to so-and-so that was probably 15 miles away. Yeah. She wouldn't think of the time involved or that, you know.
Well, and I remember Evelyn, I was only at her house a few times, but there was a lot of stuff in there. Piles of magazines and papers. And
go look at my room. And I think Evelyn had nothing. Oh, no.
I remember there were paths through the thing. You couldn't use the
She had,
table.
oh, yeah.
Well, let's get back to Oscar now. He worked as a mason, and then he was a trucker.
And I really, now these were in the earlier days, but he was a trucker as long as I could remember. And he would go around and pick up, you know, instead of these tank trucks that they have now for milk, he would go to these farmers and pick up the cream cans.
Yeah. Okay.
And deliver milk or pick up the cream. And if they needed, he would deliver butter for them. Okay. So or cheese and stuff like that.
So did he work for a creamery? Or
yeah.
Okay.
And once or maybe twice a summer, I would go with him. You know, and he really didn't like it when I went with, because I suppose I was like, are we, like the battery, are we there yet? Are we there yet? You know, but I would get a Coke. And I'd bring a peanut butter sandwich with, or cheese or whatever. And of course the Coke was warm and stuff, but I was with, and I'd be, I couldn't wait to get home, you know, because we would be on the road at 6, or in the summer it would be like 5:30. And that's a long trip for someone who's only like 7, 8 years old.
Well, and I suppose they had miles to go, and the truck only went 30 miles an hour.
Oh yeah, and then you'd stop at all these different farms and so on. In fact, if I go over to Monoman, you know, go on that road, I can still remember some of these places that we stopped at. Yeah.
So he was probably not highly educated, but
I think maybe he went probably through 8th grade.
Yeah.
And his mother lived halfway. He grew up on a farm about halfway between Ada and Twin Valley, and we'd go out there Saturday morning, and I would go with him out to the farm, and Grandma would have fresh cookies. In fact, the saliva just went in my mouth right now thinking about it, because she would either be making white sugar cookies or molasses cookies. and they were always made in a wood stove. And now Andrew was an older, now he never, you got to remember, this is conservative Norwegians. Now, they didn't talk about it. Dad was actually the older. I was much older before I figured all this out. Dad was actually the oldest child in the family. Okay, Andrew was older than Dad, but I think from, this was so quiet, he was a love child of Grandma's. And I think came over with Grandma from Sweden. But he spoke English, and he'd go on a toot every once in a while. And I think Dad would have to pick him up, and he had a Model T. I think it was a two-seater. He never married. I can remember sleeping out there once on the farm. I wish I had that farm. I mean, it wasn't worth a darn, but my kids would have just loved being out there. Or even on Grandma's, where she grew up, which was just, well, maybe 2 miles down the road, cross country, because it had a meadow. And on that side of the family, the brothers, all of them were bachelors. And blacksmiths, they did beautiful work. There was a sled there and so on, that the runners, you know, from the sled and so on.
So were your grandparents were farmers? Is that right?
Yeah, I guess, but on a small scale. I mean, really a small scale. You think of what it's like farming over there now, you know, it's just,
okay.
This would just be peanuts.
Now, I remember somebody saying that Oscar was in business with somebody doing construction at one time.
Well, I think that's when he was doing this cement work and so on, yeah.
Okay. You talked about Twin Valley. What a nice little town it is. It still is. But what was it like growing up there? You went to high school.
I never really thought of it as, and I was glad. Once I left high school, graduated, I never went back there again. I went back there to see the folks, I think maybe my freshman year of college, and that was it. I've never been back there for any length of time. I was so poor when I went to college. I didn't have money to come home, and I would work during, you know, vacations, like, you know, I would babysit. If it weren't for you kids, I probably would never have made it through college.
Well, you're welcome. So what year did you graduate high school?
50.
In 1950, and then you went to Bemidji State. Bemidji State College.
Yeah, it was State Teachers College.
Teachers College. Mm-hmm. You knew you wanted to be a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So. And
I graduated in 1954, and I made it through 4 years, and I think in 4 years I owed $400 maybe. Okay. But you could take 20 credits or 16 credits and stuff, but everything was you didn't have all these other choices and so on. But I worked down at the Hart's store, and
that was the store that my dad had.
Right, in Bob O's.
Bob O's, yep.
And I would either walk down there, because no one in college had a car. And Drex certainly didn't have it. Well, I didn't know him at that time. So I did later on.
Where did you live? Do you remember?
Well, I lived at Siri Thielander's. Do you remember Thielander's? Okay, that was one place. One place that, let's see, the first year I was there, I lived half a year with you people on Urban Avenue.
Okay, it's before my day, but...
Yeah, it was. But I would be there. But that didn't work out. I didn't have any time to study. It was wonderful. But by the time I was getting home from college, then I'd help with supper and doing dishes, and then help with 3 kids to
I wasn't there, so
bathe
it's
them.
not my fault, but
No. But bathing them and so on, and getting them ready for bed.
well, that wasn't a big house either.
I
From what I've seen, I've never been in it, but I've seen, I've driven by.
It was.
So did you walk to the college from there?
Oh, sometimes. One time I slid under the bus. And I got the giggles. And I got on that bus and I laughed and I laughed. And there sat all these people. Very stoic.
Yes.
Well, of course, they didn't know what had happened. But I ran for the bus.
Yeah.
It came on the end of the block there. It was just a half
I remember.
one
I used
lot.
to take that bus when I was a kid.
Anyhow, I came running with an armful of books, and I under the bus.
Wow.
And of course, no one saw it except the bus driver. But I got on the bus and I had the giggles. I was laughing so hard, and I looked around, and here were all these people. And then I looked around, and that even made it funnier. And of course, my funny bone gets tickled, and I'm telling you, I could just laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh. But I think I must have giggled all the way.
Well, it's a good thing you weren't hurt. But yes, that bus then would have gone down Irvin Avenue and downtown, I think, and then back toward the college.
Yeah, and
Birchmont Drive, I remember taking that.
but anyhow, it was funny.
Yeah, okay. So how did you meet Drex?
Well, let's see, I was a sophomore. He was a freshman. And it was towards the end of that year.
Okay, so you met at college.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, where was he from?
Fergus Falls.
Fergus Falls, okay.
And he must have been taking a class a methods class in track and field. And so I knew who he was, but, never any interest as far as that goes.
And you were both in
Phi Ed.
to be teachers to be Phi Ed. Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I was a week older than he was. I mean, I was the older woman in his life.
Okay.
He
It's a
told
good thing
me.
this comes out now. Okay, so you met at college.
Okay, but he was running this track meet. I mean, not running the track meet. He was running what they called at that time the broad jump. The long jump, I think, is much better. At the time, we didn't think anything about it. But anyhow, and then he was having surgery. He was up there playing to play football. Actually, he was enrolled in at Luther College to begin with. And Hub Hovland was the name of the fellow, another kid from Fergus. He asked Rex to come up with him, up to Bemidji. Never left.
And Luther is in
Iowa.
Decorah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, beautiful little town.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
And so anyhow, then it was just a couple weeks left of school, but he was having this surgery on his shoulder. He had a shoulder that always came out. The muscles were, and the other shoulder too. And so I was living with Marble. I was working at Honeywell, I think, that summer.
in the Twin Cities?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so I would go to this hospital and see him. Not very often. I think it was practically impossible to get out there. Shriners Hospital in St. Paul, maybe Midway or wherever it was. Or maybe even Maynard took me out there. And I saw him a couple times, and outside of that, nothing more. Just because we knew each other from college. Well, then even the next year at school, Well, we dated a little bit, but, you know, not that much. The same way with the junior year, he was, let's see, and then my senior year, oh, it must have been the end of my junior, I don't know. We were engaged. I can't even think right now. I can't even think. I know he was still in college. He had one more year left, so.
And where did you get married?
In Moorhead. Right, church right over here. But I was teaching in Fargo at the time, and he finished a quarter early. He had just one class yet to take, 1 3-credit course. But yeah, we got married over here. I taught school all day. We got married that afternoon, and these gals, yeah, I can't believe it. But we had no money. He was working on the police force in Bemidji at that last quarter that he didn't go to school because he just had that one class to take. And once, you know, the summer came around in Bemidji, you don't get off. I mean, Bemidji during the summertime is just too busy. So we got married on the 18th of May. And of course, everyone thought we had to get married. Boy, they counted 11 years before we got John. But, you know, and I think that's why they thought you were ours.
Oh, sure.
And I remember saying, well, how could he be? Yeah. We just got married, you know.
So you were working in Fargo, living here, and when did you move to Ada?
1959.
Okay, 4 years later.
But you see, he had this military thing hanging over. You had to be in the military for 2 years.
Well, and didn't he get drafted?
Yeah.
And didn't he get drafted twice, as I recall, or something?
Well, he was in for 2 years. We went to Parker's Prairie first. Okay. And we were there for 2 years, and he always checked with the draft board. The second year at Parker's, he knew that he was going to be drafted at the end of that school year. So then we went to Kansas, lived in Manhattan, Kansas, and then after Christmas of that year, he was shipped over to Germany, and I went to Frazee and finished out. I was there probably for a couple months. And then I went over to Germany to live with him over there. Then when we came back, we were over there for about a year. I loved it over there. Oh.
I remember that.
Yeah.
And I was just a little kid, but I remember hearing all about it. And then you brought me back my Lederhosen.
Yeah.
So I'll pop that picture in right here where it's me and you in front of your car.
And then when we came back, that's when we went to Ada in 1959.
Okay. I remember where you lived in Ada. You had this huge house. You were upstairs at first.
And that's a house that I went to when I was a little girl. Oh. That's one thing I didn't mention when I was growing up. But we would stop at this house because the people I was with, it was their relatives. And this was the house in Ada at that time.
It was big. It was huge.
Yeah. And we would stop there, and I was with a cripple and his sister. Okay. And we'd go to the county fair. But we would get over to this house and unload and get him into his wheelchair and so on. Then we'd walk to the county fair. And I'd get my $1, and that would take care, that's what I would spend at the county fair. But anyhow, we lived in that house, I think, for 5 years.
Well,
but then
squeaky floors. I don't know who waxed the floors, but they were very squeaky all the time.
Oh, really?
I remember that. And I remember the books you had. Loved the books. You had Dr. Seuss and Gus the Firefly. Yeah. And to this day, I read to the 3rd and 4th graders, and I bring McGilligan's Pool. My favorite Dr. Seuss book.
I love those books.
Yeah, that's good. So you lived there for a few years.
He lived there for 5 years, but then after 2 years at Ada, he got called up again.
Oh, that's what it was, yeah.
And so I lived in that house all by myself.
Wow.
Because the guy who lived downstairs died.
Oh.
But I was so well protected. They would check on me all the time. I'm telling you, someone, yeah. And then I went out to, he was stationed out in Washington, so I went out there.
Okay.
He was attached to they called him up to as a filler for a unit, and he said there were so many guys that didn't show up. He said if I'd known that, I wouldn't have showed up either.
Really?
In fact, his orders came to Bemidji. And your mom said they wouldn't even let me touch them.
Wow. What branch of the service?
Army.
Army. And what did he do?
He was in the medics.
He was? Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
It was a wonderful experience, really. I loved being in Germany.
Yeah.
I really did. I was not happy about coming home. Not that I would have wanted to have lived there the rest of my life, but it was such a wonderful experience that I just hated to come home.
So he was in the service. What did you do in Germany?
Nothing.
Okay.
Observe.
You learned German?
Oh, I learned a little German, loved the family that we lived with, and we had 2 rooms, 1 room upstairs, and slept in a twin bed with 3 pieces of straw that were supposed to be aired out every week. Well, then you'd have to reshape that straw again. But you know, you got used to it, but our kitchen was our living room, our kitchen, our dining room, whatever. Oh yeah, my diamond rings got in the fire in the kitchen down there. They got mixed up in some papers and I could not find them. And I told Rex there's only one place they could be, and that would have to be in the stove. I mean, as soon as you came home, you started a fire, you know, or made sure that a fire was going, or you put the tea kettle on and stuff like that. That was automatic. But the family we lived with, he was a former German soldier, and his wife Elsa, and then there was a grandmother that lived there, Oma.
Yep. What town were you in? What base and so?
Idar Oberstein, and we were close to the French border.
Okay.
Along the Mosel River. Went to Paris on our 3rd anniversary. So Drex always threw that up to me. Don't tell me that I never took you anywhere for our anniversary. Can't you just hear him? And then that was when Charles de Gaulle came into power and we weren't supposed to be there. So here we're all, anytime there was a little group of people, the gendarme would come and point the Tommy guns at them and disperse, you know. Oh gosh. And we were so scared because we had left there before we had left the post, before we were supposed to, and here we were over in Paris, and we went to the Follies and a guy had a heart attack. And then we were coming back to the post on Sunday, and we were trying to get this guy. All we wanted was a sandwich, and of course we had no money either, you know. We were poor as church mice. And they were obnoxious. Really, that's the only way of saying it. Finally, I can't remember what, but then someone from the kitchen came out. Well, yeah, they knew what a sandwich was, but they put us through hell, you know, pretending they didn't understand. I remember your dad being up in Quebec or Montreal, and these Frenchmen, and he said they would say they didn't understand, they didn't have the change or something or the other, and the Cokes would cost them a mint. A couple of people that were important in my life, oh, but don't cry, growing up, and there were a couple, that lived across the street from us, Oscar and Regina, and they always said, oh, there were times I hated. I'd go over to their house right after school on Tuesday, and they're the ones who, Mom and Dad never say anything about religion or studying for whatever, but Oscar and Regina did. And Oscar, I'd come home, I'd go over to their house on Tuesday, and I had to do my Wednesday school stuff. And boy, I couldn't go outside. They're really the ones who raised me. I went over there religiously, and they were the ones who made sure that I learned everything.
And they were right across the street?
Right across the street, and I would go over there. And, well, across the street was what would be a granary, but that was my playhouse. And so I would be so glad when the grain was taken out. It was just a little bit of grain, you know. But once grain was taken out, then my playhouse was mine. Oh, I would clean, and I would wash windows, and I would sweep, and I would, you know, it was wonderful.
Did you have friends that?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I was known for the best mud pies in town. Oh, I played in that thing a lot. But I spent a lot of time at Ocker's place. I would sit with him every Sunday afternoon. For Regina worked at the telephone office, and she would be there from 2 to 4, which isn't a long time. But she was the manual operator. But you know, she'd leave about 1:45 and get back 4:15. But for me at that time, I probably started that when I was about 5 years old, because artists did it before me.
I remember my mother talking about that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And so we lived right across the street, well, at an angle. And they were so, you know, when I would go there for lessons after school on Tuesdays, they'd always have peanut butter sandwiches for me. For me, that was a real treat because I didn't have it at home. Mom would make, fresh bread, but when she made, had made fresh bread, that was really a treat, but you wouldn't even spoil it with anything. All you wanted was butter on it. Oh, she was excellent pie maker and homemade,
Well, and they had a wood stove, too. I mean,
yeah, everything was done on a wood stove.
Yeah. And they kept, well, as I knew them, they lived in a little house right on the edge of town. I think that was different from where you were.
Well, I was out there for about 5 years. They had that hot plate.
Okay.
But you didn't bake anything in there. But they still had that other stove. You know, Mom wanted that because she could make lefse. You couldn't make lefse on a hot plate.
Well, I remember my mom saying that she never lived in the house.
Bentley house.
Saw where Grandma and Grandpa lived.
I lived there until I was probably about 11 years old.
Okay.
But Ockers, oh yeah, they bought me Christmas presents and birthday presents, and I was convinced that there was a Santa Claus until, but I can remember being really puzzled because they had a big parlor stove. And I thought, now how in the heck could Santa Claus get down that,
Good question.
down there?
And what was it about them that made them attach to you and my
I think
family?
because we would sit with Oscar so that Regina could work.
Okay.
And I think of that woman now, and I think of the hours that, you know, she would be the night operator, then she would go at night.
Yeah.
And there was a fellow named Carl who was handicapped. But we'd ask Carl, do you like cheese? Oh yeah, you bet I like cheese, you know, or chicken, or something, you know. And he was just great, but he would stay there at night. But then Regina would come home in the morning a little after 7 and get Oscar up and get him cleaned up and give him breakfast and stay with him. Then she would do everything that had to be done, and then she'd go back to work again. But on the weekends, you know, she would go to a friend's house. She'd walk to the friend's house that was on the other side of town, and she would take a bath over there because there was no running, well, they had cold running water, but that was it. And then she'd come walk back to the house, and then she would get Oscar ready for bed, and I would stay there. As I got older, I would take that night shift then too she'd go over to Lena. Can you, Lena Knudsen? About 6:45, and she'd come back, then she'd go over there and have a bath and visit with Lena, and then come back around 9, and then she'd get Oscar ready for bed, and then she'd leave the house about 9:45 and go up to the telephone office and spend the night. There was a little cot there for her to sleep on. Then she'd come back in the morning at 7, get Oscar up and stuff like that. But she'd do all her laundry. I mean, she did all of this. She did the cooking of meals and stuff. But they were so good to me. They would take me on, they'd go on little trips or little the county fair, and they always took me with. Always took me with. I mean, I was never left alone.
Did they have other kids or?
No. They were brother and sister.
Oh. Wow. Okay.
And Oscar and I would play games on Sunday afternoon and Monopoly. And someone said at 5. I said, yeah. Oscar would teach me. You know, he would just tell me what to do. He couldn't, you did most of the stuff for him because he couldn't do. But oh yeah. And we'd go through catalogs, you know, come Christmas time, and we would, you know, well, what do you like and stuff like that. And we'd have to, and of course I always got one of my favorites, but I would have to pick out my favorite. And I'd think of, where in the heck, you know, afterwards I'd think, where in the heck would they get the money? And they would give me, about Christmas time, they would give me 25 cents. We'll go down to the hardware store and pick up a Christmas tree.
A real Christmas tree?
Yeah.
For 25 cents?
Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
And I'd help them decorate it and so on. And
Did you have the tinsel part done, figured by that time?
by that time, yeah. But we would play Chinese checkers, and we'd play flinch, and we'd play, we played cards every Sunday afternoon. But there wouldn't be the regular cards. As long as it was games, it was okay, but we couldn't play, you know, cards.
Oh, okay.
But boy, did he make me, and I'm so thankful for it. And he said, well, someday you'll be happy.
Yeah.
Both Chris and John are adopted. And John was the older of the two. And he was the first one. And then 2 years later, we got Chris. And Chris is so funny. I just hated to put the kids in black or solid black or brown shoes. I think because it meant that they were growing up or he was growing up. I put him in saddle shoes, and every time he sees that picture and he says, Mother, says those saddle shoes, I've had a warped personality ever since. But also when they started school, at that time they couldn't wear jeans. They could wear slacks of some kind, but they couldn't wear jeans. They also were just at the beginning of where they could wear tennis shoes. So they had to be in leather. Oh yeah, they're so every time he sees it, he says, oh. He just shuddered. But Drex and I had a good marriage. I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Good.
I miss him.
Yeah.
20 years. But I found a clipping. I don't know where it is. But it kind of, oh, I wasn't going to cry. But it said when you're grieving, you know, if you love something enough, grieving. But we had a lot of fun.